Hey, Geoff, I have a question for you. How often do you wear sneakers?
Sneakers. I mean, that's kind of a good question. Well, for one, it depends on the season here in Portland. I'm not
Okay.
probably not wearing a lot of sneakers in sort of the rainy seasons because I want boots on to go tromping through a bunch of puddles. But right now, I definitely am wearing a lot more sneakers. I trade off between two. I have a pair of white Samba Adidas sneakers. They're pretty cool, although they're getting a little worn at this point. I might need to replace them soon.
Yep.
And then I have a pair of Vans, just sort of like,
Okay.
I guess I would classify those as like skateboarding shoes.
Uh-huh.
I guess, as maybe a subsect of sneakers or tennis shoes.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. But those are what I currently have right now.
So I think for me, I wear sneakers probably 99% of the time, like even in the winter. And I
Even in the
walk a
winter.
lot in the winter, in the rain. And I just, I don't know. It's become part of what I wear all the time. And I'm asking
Yeah.
this question because today's episode is Geography is Sneakers. And one of the arcs that we're going to follow here is the transition from sneakers or tennis shoes or sports shoes, going from being very specific for specific sports and only on the athletic field to something that's everyday fashion that it's worn all the time. And so that's kind of why I was curious what your answer.
Yeah. No, I think this is obviously I knew what this episode was going to be about broadly, as I came in it. And I think it's going to be a really fun one because, true to our name, geography is everything. I don't think people naturally think of sneakers or shoes as having a geography attached to them. But I think as we're going to find out today that there's a very interesting geography, especially once you start thinking about some of these mammoth players inside the field or sort of the industry, such as, two of the companies I mentioned, which was Adidas and Vans, right? They make a lot of shoes and they're very popular shoes at that. And right. And they're coming from different places of the world and people are gravitating towards them for different reasons. And I think all of this is going to be really interesting to, I don't know, just to learn about and sort of follow along with today.
In fact, we've got so much information on sneakers. I didn't think that we were going to go this way initially, but this will be a two-part episode or two episodes, a two-parter. There's so much to say. And hopefully by the end of the first part and certainly by the second part, people will see that the highly geographical nature of the sneaker situation.
All right, let's dive in.
Well, so there's a throwback here that we can start with to our English regional dialect episode, because we've been calling them sneakers already, but of course they're called different things throughout the country and throughout the world. Sometimes they're called tennis shoes, and we'll find out pretty quick in this episode why, because the tennis is one of the first sports that these kinds of shoes are made for. So I think it might have something to do with that. Gym shoes, running shoes, in many parts of the UK, they're called trainers. So they're called various things. The origin of the term sneakers is, I believe, in the United States. And I had trouble finding out exactly, the first use, but apparently it's a reference to the ability of the wearer to walk quietly in rubber-soled shoes, because this is opposed to shoes with leather soles, which make actually kind of a nice, satisfying sound.
Mm-hmm.
And it may have been used in the U.S. in the late 1800s, as early as the late 1800s, this term sneakers.
I guess that makes sense. I mean, shoes are in general, I would say, fairly quiet compared to, or at least my sneakers, my tennis shoes, very quiet compared to my boots, which are heavier, even though they still, I guess my boots now have rubber soled shoes or some sort of composite of plastic, I'm sure. They are still a lot heavier. They're still a lot louder than any sort of my lighter tennis shoes or sneakers.
And if you put on a pair of dress shoes with leather soles, you're going to hear a nice sound coming from those. It's hard to sneak up on somebody
Totally.
wearing leather dress shoes. When we do the research for these things, we pull from many, many different sources, and there are a lot of good books on sneakers and sneaker culture. I want to call out two of them here that were particularly helpful in my research. So I want to make sure I mention Out of the Box, The Rise of Sneaker Culture by Elizabeth Semmelback, and The Sports Shoe, A History from Field to Fashion by Thomas Turner. And these are particularly exceptional accounts about the history and the culture of sneakers. So I just want to make sure we give some props to those, because I have leaned on those a little bit for this episode.
All right.
But let's go into the early years of sneakers or sports shoes, or we're gonna have to alternate what we call them perhaps through the episode. And we've already called out one of the things that sort of separates sneakers from other shoes, which is the rubber sole. And so this is a big change. And one of the products that's necessary for the creation of sneakers is rubber, and in particular, something called vulcanized rubber. And so vulcanized rubber are used because the soles for leather was too easily soaked by moisture, and rubber repels moisture. Rubber comes from latex, which is a milky secretion from various tropical plants. It's very labor intensive to harvest, and I'll get back to the labor in just a moment. Vulcanization, because you might be wondering, is adding sulfur and heat to make rubber more stable, less brittle. And so it also tolerates heat and cold better. And so this was first developed in the 1840s by a U.S. chemist and manufacturing engineer by the name of, wait for it, Charles Goodyear.
Oh, wait, hold on. Charles Goodyear, as in, so when I think of rubber, I think of tires. When I think of tires,
right.
one of the things
this is the Goodyear. The tires are named after this guy, right?
Oh, wow. I didn't know that was an actual name of somebody. I thought it was just, I mean, you're going to have a good year, get some good tires or something.
No, this is somebody's name, right? And so the rise of sneakers and the rise of the automobile can sort of be tracked a little bit here as well.
Interesting.
Goodyear innovated this technique. Somebody else had started this technique and he took it a bit further. It was in Springfield, Massachusetts, where some 50 years later, somebody by the name of James Naismith would invent basketball. So there's an interesting place connection there. But let's go a little bit further into the history of the rubber industry, which has got a very dark history.
Mm-hmm.
So the initial largest source of rubber was from a very small part of the Brazilian rainforest, from the Amazon rainforest.
Well, and really quick, I think, because I think I've had this conversation with some people before, just in that I think there's a idea that rubber is a sort of man-made composite sort of material like plastic is. And I think it's just it's just interesting to call out here that, and you already mentioned it once, that rubber is a naturally occurring sort of material, or at least it's made from a naturally occurring material.
That's right. I mean, people have to add technology to it to make it do what we want. But yeah, latex comes from trees, basically.
Yeah, it's like almost agriculture, right?
It very much is, because I'm about to talk about some plantations, rubber tree plantations.
There you go.
So in the Brazilian rainforest, the laborers were treated extremely brutally. They were poorly paid, if paid at all. Tens of thousands of people in Brazil and different parts of the world were enslaved to harvest rubber. And so this ties very much into the story of colonialism and industrialization. And colonialism, industrialization, the rise of urbanization are things that track with the rise of the sneaker as well. It's hard to get away from that. In the late 1870s and onwards, to have more control over this product, the British established rubber plantations in Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, and then later Borneo and what is today Malaysia. By 1913, rubber exports from plantations equaled those from wild rubber exports. And then by 1920, plantation rubber dominated the global market. Now, the statistic I have from 1933, 98.6% of world rubber output came from plantations and 62% of that from British colonies. And this was driven in large part, as you mentioned, by automobile tires, but also there's a segment of that for footwear as well. So that's some of the backdrop that we're building on here to understand. Already the geography becomes really clear as this global trade and the hierarchies and the colonization involved in the rubber trade.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see here that the primary use for rubber, or at least the demand, I should say, is basically to keep things from touching the ground, right? It's basically to provide that buffer zone, probably because it's a squishable, sort of durable material that sort of allows for, I'm guessing, impact to be absorbed and not transferred to the whatever it is, the vehicle or the human.
Well, and the wheel and footwear are long-standing human innovations, right? Mm-hmm. That both undergo a huge transformation in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And we're still living with that technology today. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to ascertain really the origin of the first sneakers. I did some research. I found some references to something called the the Liverpool Rubber Company, that may have been making bonding rubber soles to canvas as early as the 1830s. I'm not sure I can say that definitively, but I can say that by the 1870s in the UK, there was a shoe that was known as plimsolls, and that were designed for wearing to the beach. Sometimes they were called sand shoes. And the shoe was designed for leisure. So that's one of the other things we're talking about here is the rise of leisure time, initially for the elite, and then subsequently for middle class, and subsequently for the working class. And so, Victorians would wear these to the beach. The athletic shoes with rubber soles were used for tennis, which I'm about to get more into, and croquet. The patterns on the soles increased the grip for the wearer. And plimsoll itself is a reference to the water line on a ship. So that line where the hull meets the water resembled the colored band on the midsole of the sneaker. And so there was a reference to ships and the water line. And these early sneakers were named after that.
Interesting. I think as I'm thinking about these shoes from the 1870s, one of the things I keep thinking about is sort of like the shoes that they would have to wear on the sort of their everyday sort of, daily lives, right? And, these are leather. They're probably have, maybe some wood or something attached to them, right? And, they're probably very clunky, very hard to get on. So I think the key word here for me that stood out was leisure, something to use for that's probably easy to put on, easy to take off. That's just all around much more comfortable.
That's right. And that's exactly what was called for. So there's, in addition to the rise of industrialization and urbanization, the rise of leisure time, there's the rise of consumer culture as well. People are looking for things to buy for specialized activities. And one of the activities, and this isn't the only sport that's happening, but one of the ones that the industry focuses on is something called lawn tennis, which emerged in the it's existed for a long time, but emerged as a very popular pastime in the UK in the second half of the 19th century, starting in approximately the 1860s. And lawn tennis is tennis that the rules are a little bit different, but it's played on grass.
Okay. That makes sense. Lawn tennis.
Right. Yeah. And there's still tennis that's played on grass, although, in the United States, it's mostly clay courts or other courts that aren't, because one of the reasons is because it's extremely demanding and expensive to upkeep grass courts, right? And so that's part of the elite situation here. And so that it was for exercise, but also a demonstration of social class to be able to participate in something like lawn tennis.
Yeah, I think the French Open is still played on a grass court.
Okay.
I don't know I don't know how much that compares to what would be called lawn tennis back then, but I think that is definitely carried over. And I think it's the only major tennis tournament left today that's still played on grass.
I've seen some references to lawn tennis or something like that going back to Egyptian times. I'm not sure if it was at all the same. And then also in France, and then the rise in the UK that accompanies industrialization, which is why we're talking about it, because we're talking about the industry of the sneaker. So there was a demand for footwear that allowed one to move around easily, to avoid slipping and falling like you might with a leather shoe, to preserve the quality of the lawn as well, because they were really, as we mentioned, expensive to upkeep. Mm-hmm. So there's a need for specialized shoes with no raised heels. And in addition to function, the aesthetics of the shoes started to matter to consumers right away. So even at the beginning or early on, let's say, of sneaker history, style seems to matter. And there's different styles that are made for men and women. In the 1870s and 1880s, lawn tennis also becomes practiced in the United States. And the industrial production of lawn tennis shoes begins in the 1880s. And people also start wearing these tennis shoes for other sports as well. And tennis shoes begin to be marketed as multi-purpose footwear. And then they also become associated with youth fashion, which is also something that is still the case today, right? So that younger people starting to wear these as sort of a way to separate themselves from the older traditions and this emergence of a more casual style. A lot of the literature wraps some of this discussion up in masculinity and how there's a shift in what is deemed to be masculine based on fashion and based on shoes in particular. So if you read a lot about this, that's something that will come up quite a bit. And of course, there's also accounts of these tennis shoes allowing someone to move about without making a whole lot of noise, and that's the sneaker thing that we talked about before.
Yeah,
but
I'm curious.
Oh yeah,
sorry,
please.
really quick, as we talk about sort of like fashion and everything, I've seen pictures of old sort of sneakers, right? I've seen pictures of really the first thing that comes to my head is sort of the classic Converse, which
right,
doesn't look all that different, from what we have today. And I think that's sort of the appeal of the Converse, right? It has that sort of classic style. But I'm curious, this is even, predates that quite a bit. I'm just trying to imagine what could they possibly sort of like look like. And maybe I can, do a little bit of Google imaging.
yeah, I mean, the Converse All-Star, which we're going to get into in a little bit, is a classic style that's still made today, which is why we know it, is because that design has changed very little, actually, in about 100 years. But if you can think of some low top, like Keds or something like that, you know what those are.
Yeah.
With the rubber sole, pretty low, not a whole lot of laces necessarily compared to some contemporary shoes. That, I think a lot of early sports shoes or sneakers kind of looked like that a little bit.
Okay.
And if you mentioned, there's one of these books in particular, I guess it's Out of the Box, that is actually written in conjunction with an art exhibit, and they chronicle. So they have this exhibit in a museum with sneakers over time, and some of those earlier sneakers, some of them don't look all that different from some things that still exist. Of course, the technology in sneakers has changed quite a lot, and so some of the sneakers look very different, but some of them look very similar.
Yeah, well, and I do remember. So, not to riff too much, but we're going to talk about Converse more. But just talking about the design of it, how it hasn't changed. I do remember distinctly, when I was younger, Converse still came with a very sort of flat, hard sole.
Yes,
and I think that was
not a ton of support in
not a ton of support. I think that was a legacy from when they were first made. And I remember when, and maybe it's because they got purchased by somebody else, I'm not sure, but there was like a shift where it's like, okay, now Converse it's like the comfortable Converse or something like that. I don't remember if that was the exact branding, but it's the comfortable Converse. And now you can get it and it'll be like a nice soft sole. So that you can actually run and do things. Yeah.
They had to compete, right? With all these other companies that were making shoes that were more contemporary, provided more support. But yeah, exactly. We'll get to that. But there is one company I want to mention right now, which is one of the early sports shoes manufacturers from the UK. And this is J.W. Foster and Sons. So this was a British company founded by Joseph William Foster. They first fabricated running shoes.
Oh, interesting.
And then they were one of the early developers of spikes for traction, for track shoes. Foster's grandsons, Geoff and Joe, went on to find their own shoe company in 1958, a company called Reebok.
Oh, Reebok. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know Reebok.
Yeah.
They're,
of course you do.
They've been around forever. I think I've had a few pairs of Reebok shoes throughout sort of, my existence. And I think they've
been around for our lifetime, certainly, because they've been around since 1958.
Yeah. And they got bought by somebody, right?
This is what happened. So in 76, Reebok acquired J.W. Foster and Sons, which is an interesting thing, right? Because that's where they emerged
came
from.
Back and bought.
But in 2005, Adidas acquired Reebok. And then subsequently, very recently in 2021, Reebok was sold to something called the Authentic Brands Group, which has lots of different brands. And so this is another thing that we'll be able to track throughout our episodes, is that, certain companies emerge, they separate, they're bought out by another company. And this is the story of industry more generally as well.
Interesting. Yeah. I had heard that they were purchased by some large company, Adidas or Nike or something. I guess in this case, it's Adidas. I had not heard that they were now part of some other company. So,
Yep, this is much more recent.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to get into it a little bit more, but before we do, it's time for us to take a short ad break.
All right, let's do it. We will be right back. Cool. Almost exactly at 20 minutes. You timed these very
Perfect.
well.
What's that?
You always seem to time your parts very well.
Good. Well, we'll see if that trend continues, but I'm glad that first one worked out. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay. You ready?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to clap you back in.
Welcome back to the Geography is Everything podcast. We are talking about geography as sneakers today. And we talked a little bit before the break about the rise of sneakers or proto sneakers in the 1800s. And let's get to the 20th century here and talk a little bit about 20th century mass production. Canvas is one of the main materials that's used for the upper of shoes, of sneakers when they first are developed. And they were easier to mass produce at the time than leather. And, let's look at what's happening in the first couple decades of the 20th century. Popular participation in sport continues to increase. After World War I in the United States, there's a national movement for fitness. And the idea is, particularly for men who might sometime be soldiers, to take on that role of soldier, that it's a patriotic duty to be physically fit. And this is not only in the United States that this happens, but this is in many other countries as well. So there's the role of the state in pushing fitness, and then people are wearing stuff for that. Motion pictures in the media, at least in the United States, certainly, are promoting this image of bodily perfection.
Oh boy.
Which has continued and only amped up since then. But this idea of an idealized body type, the athletic body, and this becomes something that people start to gravitate towards, starts to become obsessed with in some cases. And so the rise of consumer culture and sneakers in particular is tied to this image as well.
Yeah. It's interesting thinking about this progression. And obviously this is a episode about sneakers, which is only one small aspect of this idea of bodily perfection, the athletic body as being the ideal body, when I feel like it was, maybe only 1800s or before that a little bit, when the ideal body type was somebody who was perhaps had a little bit more, was not as athletic, not quite as, maybe, had a lot more fat, body fat content on them, right? Because the idea was that translates to wealth.
It was a sign of wealth and affluence, and to be, very thin was a sign of perhaps a lack of affluence.
Yeah, or illness or something like that.
Yeah, as you're saying, these bodily images that we have, and, in the contemporary world, we're starting to break away from that, I think, which is amazing that, people are starting to recognize that there's not one type that everybody can conform to. But of course, that's still very much a thing. Right. And after all this time, part of it we can track back to 100 years ago and the rise of media and the portrayal of the way that people should look, which is a difficult thing.
Absolutely.
The other thing that happens here is that the development of leisure time starts to extend to the working class as well. And in the United States and in Europe in particular, unions play a role in that, because the unions are demanding things like a weekend and shorter time, shorter work times, so that there does emerge a bit more time in people's schedules to recreate and to either watch sports. And that's not the only thing people do with leisure time, but to watch sports or to participate them in as well. And this also amplifies the desire or the market for sneakers. Press reports suggest that in the early 1920s, the average factory that was producing footwear was producing 20,000 pairs of tennis shoes a day. Right. So this is like 100 years. It's 100 years ago. It seems like a lot. By the 1920s and 30s, assembly line production and scientific management of athletic shoes is in full effect. Professional sport in the United States and British society, fueled by mass media, continues to grow at this time. And there's also what we start to see if we look at some of the ads and some of the way these are marketed is a rhetoric of technical advances in tennis shoes. So that the fabrication matters, and that the standard part of both development and marketing is that this is a better shoe. And that also remains true today. There's very much this idea that there's some kind of innovation. This is better. It's longer lasting. It's more support. And this remains true today. This talking about this.
Absolutely. I think I just saw, I don't know, some commercial. I think it was about an Adidas shoe that now like tracks has like some technology built in. It like tracks your vital statistics. If you buy, a pair of, cleats for, soccer, for example, and you're running up and down the field, and it sort of tracks like sort of how fast you're moving, how, I don't know, all kinds of different metrics that then go to an Adidas app on your phone, and, all this sort of, almost like gamification of of just what you're wearing.
And other major Nike and other producers of sneakers have kind of a version of that as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think with the innovation of, tracking that's available on phones and watches, that's probably one of the reasons why I haven't seen more of that, I'm guessing.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly that's a thing, right? Like
Totally.
as you're saying, that computer technology in a shoe is something that exists and something that we might see more of. Let's highlight a few companies from the early 20th century that most people have heard of, but they might not know a lot about the history of. And I think it's instructive to look at some of these case studies to understand the development, the history of the sneakers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm going to start with a company most people haven't heard of, which is the U.S. Rubber Company, which was founded in 1892 in Naugatuck, Connecticut. A little shout out for my home state of Connecticut there.
There we go.
And it's interesting that it's rubber companies that are making shoes initially, and that goes with what we've been talking about. The necessary ingredient for shoes is rubber, and the worldwide the worldwide industry that has a real dark side that we talked about before.
And that seems to be something that we see across industry, right? It's always, it typically seems to start out as the manufacturer of the base material starts making something else with that material that's not really their, for lack of a better word, wheelhouse. Right. And then all of a sudden, now they sort of spin off and create this other company, or they become that company as that product takes off, right? This all seems to be, this is something that seems to track through multiple industries.
And this company is exactly an example of what you're talking about. Mm. It was a consolidation of 9 different companies, which eventually became known as Uniroyal in 1961, which is a tire company. Uniroyal in 1990 was acquired by Michelin.
Oh, there you go.
And this isn't the last time we'll see a connection between tires and sneakers. Mm-hmm. The company established a rubber plantation in Sumatra in 1911. And between 1892 and 1913, the rubber footwear division made shoes under many different brand names. But one of them emerges. The footwear companies are all consolidated into one brand in 1916 called Keds.
Oh, yeah.
And so this is a company that I think many people in the United States know. I know when I was growing up, Keds were almost it was like Kleenex. It's like interchangeable with the word for sneakers or something like that.
Which can be dangerous. I actually
that's
just
right.
listened
I mean,
to
that's what a company
yeah.
wants, is right to be synonymous with that, and other companies don't want that.
Yeah.
Apparently, they were first called Peds.
For like
the pedestrian thing, but that trademark was already taken. And so they turned it to Keds because it was Peds for kids or Keds or something. So this was an early marketing thing. 1917, rubber soled shoe with a canvas top, and they're marketed as sneakers. So sometimes you'll read that Keds started the term sneakers, although a bunch of other sources that I've read suggest that the word sneakers actually predates that. But in terms of marketing a shoe as sneakers, I think Keds might be the first around 1917. In 1949, Pro Keds appear on the market as a performance shoe and intended to compete with a company I'm about to talk about, which is Converse.
Oh, boy.
Keds was acquired by Stride-Rite in 1979, and then a company that I hadn't heard of called Wolverine Worldwide in 2012. That's, I believe...
That's who owns Keds now.
That's right. I believe that's
Interesting.
The case. Still owned by that company.
It's funny. For whatever reason, for a long time, Keds was sort of off my radar. I only recently sort of had heard about this company, maybe within the last 5 years, when some of my friends were talking about needing to buy new Keds, and I don't know if they were going through like a new wave of interest and popularity, as brands often do. But this one sort of escaped me, and I think the next one we're going to talk about, which is Converse, is definitely something that was on my radar from a very young age.
Same with me. I mean, Keds for me growing up it felt like an older shoe, right? Like from years past. And although Converse is actually just as old, that had a lot more purchase with, and
totally
purchase them. Yeah. This had a lot more, desire from at least the group of people that I was friends with growing up. And so let's talk about Converse. 1908, an individual called Marquise Converse, so this again is somebody's name, established the Converse Rubber Shoe Company in Malden, Massachusetts, initially producing rubber boots. And then 1915 started making tennis shoes, and then came out with their first basketball shoe in 1917 called the Converse All-Star.
There it is.
So the All-Star is over 100 years old, right?
Yeah.
It went on to Keds and Converse dominated the basketball market in the United States until the 1960s.
Neither of those brands are associated with basketball today, in my opinion.
Not as much. Yeah. No, certainly not. There's other ones that we'll get to that are much more known for that. And Nike in particular, of course, I think.
Right, of course.
1923, a semi-pro basketball player from Indiana named Chuck Taylor becomes a salesman for Converse. And in 1932, the Converse All-Stars begin carrying his name.
Oh,
so Chuck Taylor, I mean, we called him Chucks growing up.
Yeah.
And so this was a basketball player. It wasn't like, you don't want to take anything away from Mr. Taylor, not necessarily an all-star in the way that we think about all-stars today, but it was named after him because he went to work for the company and started pushing the product. And then his name and signature were on the shoe, and they're still called that today.
Yeah, I know. When I was a teenager, my friends would often say, like, I need to go get a new pair of Chucks or something like that. And I obviously I knew what that meant. I knew it meant a new pair of Converse. I never put too much thought into why they would be called Chucks. I thought it was, some weird variation of Converse or something like that. I did not ever associate it with an actual person or a player's name.
Chuck Taylor's, that's right. And, in 1962, they came out with their first low-cut All-Star. So it was all high tops with the very distinctive, circle near the ankle, which I think originally, and I don't even know if Converse started this, was to protect the ankle. It's cosmetic now, but that was actually a functional thing at one point. But of course, it became branding. As I mentioned, it became standard wear for NBA players, and the design didn't change hardly at all from the time that it was started. However, in 1962, Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points in an NBA game wearing Converse All-Stars.
Wow.
And then to jump ahead in the story just a little bit, in 2003, Converse was acquired by Nike for $309 million.
There it goes. Yeah. And I think I knew Converse was now owned by Nike.
So it still functions as an independent shoe company, more or less, but it's owned by Nike. So let's talk about another company here, Dunlop, which tracks back. The name of the shoe tracks back to a Scottish veterinarian named John Boyd Dunlop, and you'll like this, who developed the first viable pneumatic tire in 1887, 1888. It's basically a reinvention of something that a patent had already existed in 1847, but not much had been done with that. And so this completely transforms the bicycle industry to have inflatable tire.
Yeah, inflatable tires.
But it was after J.B. Dunlop's death that the company began making sports shoes, which was in 1929. And they came out with one called the Green Flash tennis shoe, which had a green sole. It was endorsed by three-time Wimbledon winner Fred Perry in the 1930s. And so we start to see famous athletes start to attach their names to shoes. And that's something, of course, that's a big part of the shoe industry today.
Oh, these are cool. Sorry, I'm just looking at some vintage Green Flashes. They look really cool.
This might rekindle some desire for people to branch out a little bit from their own styles and check out some of these old styles and what they were all about.
Absolutely.
But I had to do the same thing when I was researching this. I'm like, what do these things look like? And look at it. I'm like, wow, that's a really interesting design. That's really cool.
Yeah.
1906, there's a company that starts making arch supports for shoes called New Balance. This is founded in Boston. And they don't start making running shoes until 1960s, the first of which was called the Trackster. And sales increased in the 1970s during the jogging and running boom, which is something that we'll touch upon later in either this episode or the next one. But the one thing I do want to mention about New Balance before we move on is that they still have manufacturing production in the United States and Great Britain. And of course, that is not a hallmark of some of the other bigger companies, something else that we'll definitely need to talk about in a little bit.
Interesting. Is it just some manufacturing or is it still predominantly located here?
That I don't know the answer to that. And I should have the answer because that's a great question. Mm-hmm. But there's at least some, like enough, more than like a cosmetic amount, I think.
Right. I guess that's what I was going for, right? Because I'm sure like, Adidas, for example, I don't know where they're manufacturing the shoes, but, I'm sure if most of their manufacturing is coming out of Vietnam, I'm sure they might still have some sort of boutique manufacturing out of Germany.
Right. Same thing with Nike.
Mm-hmm.
Having some very small amount of production happening in the United States. But I think New Balance is quite a bit more.
Okay.
Cool. Again, this is something our listeners can maybe sort out and get back to us on.
We lean on you all a lot.
That's right.
This is a team effort here, this podcast.
That's right.
It's not just me and Hunter.
The collective knowledge of our listeners is infinitely greater than what Geoff and I know. And so, let's think about it that way. World War II disrupts the shoe industry, as you would expect, because the resources for that goes into putting sneakers together is used to outfit soldiers and is used for the war effort. And production for civilians of sneakers in particular is greatly reduced. But after World War II, things change pretty rapidly. There's many new developments, new synthetic materials used in design and manufacturing. New designs that broke from the standard models of the pre-war era, the rise of companies that focused more exclusively on sports shoes rather than rubber companies, an increasing specialization for different sports. And then there's a baby boom in the United States that increases. This happens at a time where, not for all Americans, but for many people in the United States, there's an increase in disposable income. There's an increase in population. There's an increase in demand. There's also the increase of television, which also spurred the spread of sneakers because there's advertisements, but also people watching professional athletes on television wearing particular sneakers, wearing particular sports shoes, and wanting to wear those as well. For the first half of the 20th century, sneakers were probably more for sports, but it's early in the 1950s, young people wear them more and more as street fashion. And James Dean wore sneakers and Rebel Without a Cause. And this becomes, that's just one example. This becomes something that becomes a phenomenon that we'll be talking about, throughout this episode and the next, because sneaker as fashion is probably eclipsed sneaker as function in a lot of ways.
Right. Well, and I think I could riff on that a little bit here, because sneaker as fashion is definitely a huge aspect of it. But I'm also thinking about some of these earlier shoes, again, that people might have been wearing even back in the 1950s and 1960s, people gravitating towards sneakers purely just for the comfort aspect of it, right? And I say this as somebody who predominantly wears, I have a pair of Danner boots that I wear mostly during winter because they're waterproof, they're leather, they look nice, they go with sort of the winter aesthetic, so to say. Yep. But they are not as comfortable as, and this is nothing against Danner boots, they're really comfortable boots, but they're not as comfortable as a pair of sneakers, right? Where you can just sort of slip them on. They sort of mold to your foot because of all the cushioning, everything like that.
Yeah, I mean, after a while, sneakers, if you wear them long enough and they stay viable to wear, they become like slippers almost.
Exactly.
I don't even have to lace them up anymore. I just slide them on and walk out the door.
That is a hallmark for me for a good sneaker, or really a good shoe outside of boots, is if I can put them on without having to relace them every time. If they don't meet that bar after like the first week or two, they're not lasting too long in my closet.
Gotta believe we're not the only ones who are thinking
absolutely. This way. The other thing I wanted to touch on really quick before we move on here is I was looking at the Keds website because I was like, curious, like what's going on at Keds, what's happening with them, and really trying to suss out like, why haven't I really heard about this up until very recently? And one of the things I have learned is that Keds is predominantly, maybe almost entirely, marketed for women and kids only.
Okay.
Children. I do not see really any shoes here that are for men. In fact, I don't think they might not have any shoes that would be for men.
And that's only been in the last, I'm going to say, maybe 40 years or something. Because up through at least the 70s, Keds were popular choice for boys as well.
Yeah, which is interesting because I think that would then play into like, well, obviously I'm not their target market. So
Right.
why would I know? And in which case,
Right.
they're probably really good at marketing to their target market. So I just wanted to bring that up really quick before we move on.
Well, in fact, before we move on any further, I think it's time for us to dip into another short ad break and come back and talk about sneakers in a few moments.
Okay, great. Let's do that. And we will be right back.
Welcome back. Geoff and Hunter here talking about geography as sneakers. And we've brought our story up through post-World War II and the rise of a lot of factors that are contributing to sneaker sales. And I think this is a good time for us to talk about a number of companies that are extremely well known today for sneakers and get into a little backstory of them because I think it's instructive and interesting for people. And the first of these is a company that was founded in 1924 by the name of Gebr. Dassler Schuhfabrik. And this was...
That was a good accent.
Thank you. I practiced that one. I don't know how close I was, but I'm hopefully I was okay with that. We've got Adolf Dassler and Rudolf Dassler, who are brothers, and they form a partnership, and they're making shoes. They have nicknames, right? So Adi, Adolf's nickname is Adi, and Rudolf's nickname is Rudy. And Adi is the shoemaker, and Rudy is the salesman. And they started making shoes, making running shoes. They made track shoes with a leather sole and hand-forged spikes. And they were working hard to try to get these in the hands or on the feet of well-known athletes. And in 1936, Jesse Owens wore their shoes at the Berlin Olympics and won 4 gold medals in them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But in 1948, the Dassler brothers have a falling out and they split ways. The nature of that falling out is heavily debated, I think. But in any case, they go in 2 different directions. And Adi forms his own company, and he comes up with the name by taking part of his first name and part of his last name together. So Adi Dassler becomes Adidas.
There you go.
And this is the company that starts in 1949. And then his brother Rudolf, or Rudy, starts another company that was originally called Ruda, because he's doing the same thing, like Rudolf and Dassler, except that gets changed to Puma at one point.
Oh, interesting.
Adidas and Puma were founded by brothers who are in competition with one.
So I guess I don't know exactly how large Puma is, but I know it's a large company. I know Adidas
pretty big.
Is absolutely one of the largest sort of
That's right.
apparel or footwear companies. I don't know how they describe themselves. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that 2 of the probably largest footwear apparel companies stem from the same origin, which I certainly didn't know that before this.
It's remarkable, right?
Yeah.
That's quite a family to have started these brands that are still very well known, very popular,
very prominent. Mm-hmm.
And I'll probably focus a little bit more on the Adidas story here, but I'll throw in some information about Puma as well. And Adi, as the shoe manufacturer himself, is really obsessed with the technical abilities, the technical innovation associated with the shoes. I'm really focusing on the market of athletes themselves originally, right? That's the original idea. Now, one of the things that people who know anything about sneakers know is that the sneakers are pretty readily recognizable by the logo that they have.
Yeah.
And for Adidas, it's the 3 stripes, right? I mean,
totally.
Everybody knows that.
Very I mean, not even just on their shoes, but like now for example, Major League Soccer teams have Adidas jerseys and they all have like the 3 stripes that run down the shoulders and the sides. And I think that's pretty common for any sort of jersey or clothing, right?
And the idea was that most sports shoes early on were a single color. I want to say that they were white, and they were hard to distinguish from one another. And so trying to brand them in a particular way so that people would know what they were was something that in the post-war era became extremely important and it became a big focus. But the 3 stripes branding actually was not associated with Adidas at first. It was associated with a Finnish company called Karu Sports. And in 1952, Adidas bought the rights to the three stripes away from this Finnish company. And the rest
wild.
is history, as they say. That's really interesting. I never knew that they had basically lifted that from, legally, because they got the rights to it.
Well, it seems interesting just because, I mean, three stripes, I mean, it's very iconic today. It seems like it probably wasn't, I mean, it couldn't have been that iconic back then. Otherwise, it would probably be, you probably wouldn't be able to buy it at all. It just seems interesting that they didn't just hire somebody to create a brand new sort of branding or something like that.
I mean, there's more to the story that would be interesting to find out.
Yeah.
Part of this, once again, goes back to televised sports and the idea that you want to be able to have somebody recognize your
instantly
brand when you're watching athletes compete.
That is true.
And then Puma has the very distinctive, what they call the form strip, right? That sort of curvy line that hugs the shoe, and that becomes their recognizable brand. Also, when I think of Adidas, I think of the trefoil logo, which is pretty famous. That came along in 1971, so that came along a little bit later. So Adidas developed a fair amount of market dominance among athletes in certain sports early on. So one of the statistics I have here was that the 1966 World Cup. So I think back in 1954, the German national team wore them. I think that was the year they won the World Cup. So that was, a huge boost. But in the 1966 World Cup, 75% of the players wore Adidas, including many of the English players who in England won the World Cup in 1966. And then at the 1968 Olympics, apparently some 80% of athletes were wearing Adidas shoes at this time. So if you go back really not that long ago, Adidas had a huge amount of market dominance in various sports. We'll bring this story forward at some point. But I also want to mention something about Puma that occurred in the 1968 Olympics. So medalists Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who were track athletes, wore Puma suedes. And they very famously took them off and placed them on the podium as they bowed their heads and raised their fists as in protest during the U.S. national anthem. And so this was for, Black rights. And this was a way of using the platform of sports to articulate the need for a larger change in society, something that is a huge part, I would argue, of what's happening, not among all athletes, but among many athletes today. And this was a huge moment in the sort of sports cultural history when Tommy Smith and John Carlos made that extremely powerful display as they were on the medal stand.
Yeah, I mean, that's an iconic, I can see the image in my head, right, of the two of them standing there. I didn't realize, well, one, I don't know if I realized that they were wearing Puma shoes. I didn't realize they took their shoes off either.
That part of the story, I think, is less known because people are focusing on the fact they've got the black glove.
They have the raised fist.
Fists they're raising and they're bowing their heads. But taking off the shoes was part of that as well. And that's part of the story that's not quite as well known. So the 1960s, we'll return back to the Adidas story for just a moment here. Adi's son, Horst Dassler, begins managing an Adidas factory in France. And Horst becomes a really important part of pushing different aspects of Adidas that are well known today. In 1964, he released a tennis shoe called the Halle, which is associated with the French tennis player Robert Halle. It had some structural advancements, and instead of the three stripes, had three rows of perforations that went along the side of the shoe. And maybe some of you who are listening know where we're headed now that I've mentioned that, because it enters into the U.S. market in 1971 and is renamed for the American Wimbledon champion, Stan Smith.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. I mean, I had to find this out as well. So this started as a different name, comes in the U.S. market, is renamed. This is still a very popular shoe today. Horst also begins to design a shoe for the basketball market, but I'm going to save more of that story for the next episode when we're going to talk more explicitly about the rise of basketball and sneakers in basketball and some of the things associated with that. Adidas and Puma were fierce rivals, and in amidst their competition to get top athletes to wear their shoes, they gave a lot of shoes away and eventually started paying athletes to wear their shoes. And this, of course, is a huge part of the sneaker industry today, and something that we'll talk more about as well, because the getting a contract and having a signature shoe is something that we think is almost automatic now, but that's something that's that tracks back in part to this era in the 1960s, 1970s.
Right. I mean, we're constantly hearing about, famous soccer player, famous basketball player, signing a deal with Nike or Adidas or maybe Puma for, X amount of dollars so that they'll wear their shoe when they're playing, on the court or in the field, to do whatever. Right. I think that's pretty common. I'm not sure how expensive those deals are these days, but I imagine it's probably worth a pretty penny.
Oh, it's massive. It's absolutely massive. So Adi Dassler dies in 1978, and his son Horst later eventually becomes head of the company. And Horst is one of the leaders who pushes Adidas towards more garment production and leisure styles. And so the Adidas tracksuit, for example, is very iconic and well known.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're talking about either Nike or Adidas or Puma, these are shoe companies, but they have a lot more as well. And now that athleisure has become a huge part of society, and people can dress like they're about to compete in an Olympic sport when they're walking down the street, has played into that as well. Let's shift continents here. So, because we're talking about Adidas and Puma, we're talking about companies that start in Germany. Let's talk about Onitsuka. And the Onitsuka company, starts in 1949 in Kobe, Japan, founded by Kihachiro Onitsuka. And I'm going to just make it easy for everybody by knowing that in 1977, this is a company that's renamed ASICS.
Oh, I know ASICS.
Yeah.
They're my running shoe. Well,
yeah.
I've used them in the past. I think right now I'm on Brooks, but that's a whole other side thing.
So this is a company that emerges in the early years after World War II. ASICS, incidentally, is an acronym for the Latin expression "anima sana in corpore sano," which means you should pray for a healthy mind and a healthy body, which seems pretty high concept. And maybe there's a reason this is coming out of Japan and not the United States.
Yeah. If I can just talk about sort of the geography of language and branding here a little bit, this Japanese Onitsuka, Japanese shoemaking company, renames themselves to ASICS, named for a Latin expression that, obviously
this is an expression from the Roman satirist Juvenal from, 2000 years ago or something like that.
Just fascinating how this sort of tracks, how the Latin tracks all the way over to Japan, which is not obviously a Latin language.
But, there's a mentality in the 70s then of being a global company.
That's true.
And of course, a lot of people might not necessarily know that this brand name comes from this expression, but yeah, there's this embracing of the global in a certain way to name.
Yeah, and I imagine it's during this time as well, and this is a whole other side, but that we start to see a lot of, Japanese companies and maybe Korean and Chinese, companies. Well, maybe that comes later, but start to adopt English sort of versions of their names and logos and everything, right? In order to have that more global purchase.
That's right. So 1950, Onitsuka starts making its first shoes are basketball shoes. It makes its first running shoes, which are geared towards marathon running, in 1953. In 1954, the company's first nylon shoe appears on the market. It's durable, it's lightweight, it's water resistant. So this is part of that trend of using different materials in the post-war era to make sneakers. The first wrestling shoe is released in 1955. Now, I wrestled in high school several decades ago, and I remember there almost only being ASICS wrestling shoes at the time. I think there were, obviously other companies made them, but almost everybody wore ASICS because they were the most readily available more than anything else. 1960, it released its Olympic line of shoes. And then in 1964 releases the Tiger. And a version of that was released produced for the Mexico Olympics in 1966. And it was the first to feature the very iconic tiger stripes design that ASICS is now known for. This is a company that makes shoes for many other sports, innovated volleyball and baseball shoes. But in 2002, the Onitsuka Tiger was relaunched. And so I think people are, who know the shoe are familiar with the tiger stripes, as the company calls them. And that's their version of the wearable brand that makes the shoe recognizable. Perhaps one of the biggest moments culturally for this particular shoe, the Onitsuka Tiger, was that it was worn by Bruce Lee in the film Game of Death, which was released in 1978. Bruce Lee died in 1973. And I mean, we could do an entire episode not only on Bruce Lee's life as this incredible global icon, but even the film Game of Death, because his big opponent in the Game of Death, I don't know if you've seen it, Geoff.
I have not seen this, no.
So spoiler alert for anybody who wants to just dip out for a second here. Bruce Lee fights Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and the
really
climatic scenes of the movie, and Kareem is 7'4" and Bruce Lee was not 7'4". But it was this amazing sequence. Anyways, a different model, the Tai Chi LE, was subsequently worn by Uma Thurman in Kill Bill, which maybe some of our listeners might be more familiar with, although that film was on 2003.
That's not 20 years old.
It's the yellow and black that Bruce Lee wore and that Uma Thurman wore in Kill Bill. So,
the very, like, I can picture it's like very iconically yellow, because I think she wears a lot of yellow in that.
Yeah, there's the yellow and black tracksuit that goes along with it. There's a part of the Onitsuka story that becomes very important for this next company that we're going to talk about. So we'll hold back on that part of the story so we can talk about Blue Ribbon Sports. You know Blue Ribbon Sports, right?
I have no idea what Blue Ribbon Sports is.
All right, well, let me help you out a little bit.
Okay.
In 1964, a guy named Phil Knight, along with his former track coach, Bill Bowerman, founded something called Blue Ribbon Sports. That was subsequently rebranded in 71, 72 as Nike. And now everybody knows who we're talking about.
Now I know. I had never heard of Blue Ribbon Sports. I did not know that was the original name for Nike.
It was probably a good call to rename the company, I'm thinking.
I would say so. Although, as I think about, actually probably. So when I first think of Blue Ribbon, I think of Pabst Blue Ribbon, which is a very iconic beer with a very iconic blue ribbon on it.
Right.
And I think actually didn't actually ever win a blue ribbon.
I don't want to get too much into that right now.
That's a whole other episode.
We need to find that out. It's the kind of trivia that geography is not really about, but that becomes interesting to talk about.
Becomes interesting. Yeah. All right.
So Phil Knight went to the University of Oregon. His track coach was Bill Bowerman. And Bill Bowerman was always trying to innovate shoes, coming up with new designs and coming up with a lighter shoe. This was something he was well known for. And Phil Knight, after the University of Oregon, went on to Stanford Business School. And he wrote a master's thesis at Stanford saying, wouldn't it be a good idea to manufacture shoes in a different part of the world other than the United States to avoid spending so much on labor costs, and then to avoid the massive sort of capital investment involved in owning factories.
No way.
And so, very few people have probably written a master's thesis that they've been able to realize as successfully as Phil Knight did, probably, I would argue.
I don't know if he was necessarily the first person to think of this idea, but that very well could be a master's thesis that upended the world a little bit in terms of globalizing.
Not too many master's theses have that kind of global impact. I think.
I would say the vast majority don't.
And so what Knight was looking at was trying to improve U.S. because at the time Converse and Keds were the really popular U.S. brands, and again they hadn't really changed their design very much since they were started in the late 19-teens.
Mm-hmm.
And he was looking at the German companies, probably Adidas and Puma in particular, and looking at their innovation and thinking that, we want to be rivaling these companies. And so they came up with this idea that if they made the shoes in Japan, that they could do it at a lower cost. And so they made an agreement with Onitsuka, who became Asics, right? So they made it. And so the first Nike shoes, or some of the first Nike shoes at least, were made by Onitsuka and branded with the Nike logo, which we're going to talk about in a second as well. And Bowerman extols something that becomes known as jogging. So running and jogging become huge in the 1970s in the United States. And I know you weren't around for that, but I remember my parents were part of this, and that became this really popular pastime, this individual way to become fit. And
I mean, there's this very famous sort of scene from Anchorman, if you've ever seen the movie with Will Ferrell. And obviously it takes place during the 1970s in San Diego. And he says something to the effect of, we're going to go, I think it's called yogging or something like that. Because he thinks it's some foreign sort of aspect that's now like coming to the US. And he's like, apparently you just run for extended period of time.
Well, it's interesting because apparently one of the places where jogging emanates from is that, and Bowerman apparently got the idea to push this from New Zealand's Olympic track coach Arthur Lydiard. And so apparently jogging becomes really popular in New Zealand because their Olympic coach starts to push it there. So there's another moment of globalization for us where this cultural phenomenon that's happening in a different part of the world gets exported to the United States and takes off. And the early success of Nike was very much wrapped up in running and in jogging. In fact, the first running shoe produced by Blue Ribbon Sports, which then becomes Nike and becomes Nike's first shoe, is the Cortez, which is actually one of my favorite models in Nike shoes. It's a very classic design, designed apparently by Bowerman, made by Onitsuka, and also features the swoosh. And the swoosh, Geoff, I hope that you know this, was designed by a graphic design student named Carolyn Davidson in 1971, who was a graphic design student at Portland State University, where you and I teach.
No, I had no idea. I did not know that Portland State University had a hand in developing I would argue, one of the most iconic, most obviously noticeable brands in the entire world.
This is the story. And I guess Phil Knight had a short stint as an instructor there, maybe in the business school or something like that.
Okay.
And so Carolyn Davidson charged Phil Knight by the hour to produce this. It was 1970s wages. And so the final invoice for producing the swoosh was $35.
I mean, if I think about this a little bit, it seems like obviously a stupidly low rate for one of what has become one of the most iconic logos in the entire world by one of the most mammoth companies in the entire world. But it's like this was designed during a time that's, Nike wasn't really a thing, right? And, it just happened to become sort of that. So it's kind of funny to think about $35 being such a low wage, but
I will say, though, that in 1983, Phil Knight gave Carolyn Davidson 500 shares of Nike stock, which have subsequently subdivided into tens of thousands of shares of Nike stock.
Oh, my God. That must be worth a lot of money. Okay.
So
Carolyn Davidson got paid.
You only stop at $35. It looks pretty raw, but the idea is that this is an individual who was eventually compensated for this with Nike stock, which is worth quite a lot. And famously, Phil Knight was not really enamored with the logo and said something to the effect of, maybe it'll grow on me. And I suspect it probably has, because as you said, it is one of the recognizable logos in the world. I mean, a lot of people know this logo now.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So as a measure of Nike's growth in 1972, sales were $2 million, which is not too shabby, right? For a company that's just a few years old, I think. Net income was $60,000. And then 10 years later in 1982, sales were $694 million and the net income was $49 million. So incredible
That seems pretty
growth
good.
in the first 10 years of the company's existence under the name Nike. So Blue Ribbon Sports has this agreement with Onitsuka. There eventually is a falling out, or the agreement ends in some way. And so Nike contracts with the Nippon Rubber Company to manufacture Nike shoes. When production costs in Japan rise, manufacturing agreements are switched to factories in Taiwan and South Korea, where most of the production is through, I think, most of the 1980s. And then subsequently to Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and China. And if we want to bring the story forward a little bit more, to Vietnam as well, and Malaysia, probably other countries as well. The standardization of the container shipping industry also lowered costs and helped make this arrangement possible. And keep in mind here that Nike doesn't own any factories in Asia. It subcontracts them out, the production, to different companies, which makes for a very flexible arrangement. Not a lot of fixed capital tied up there. Nike's focus was on design, on marketing, on developing the brand.
Right. I think, for people who don't know, Nike is, headquartered here inside the Portland metro region where Hunter and I are located. And so obviously, I know quite a few people who work at Nike, and I talk with them, and, basically what they've told me is, well, what we do here at HQ is marketing and design, right? It's and sales, I'm sure, right? Marketing, design, and sales. That's what they do. They don't actually, they're not manufacturing anything here at the Portland headquarters here. I think they still have thousands of employees here, but they're all tied up in one of these other sort of.
Yeah. And some of that is design and technical design and different things, but the actual manufacturing happens elsewhere. So there's an interface that happens with factories in different parts of the world, in China, Vietnam, other places.
Right.
We'll say a few more things about Nike, and then we'll have to wrap it up because we've got a whole nother episode worth of material here. But let me say that in 1984, Nike signed a contract with a 22-year-old who had never played a professional game before. His name was Michael Jordan. And he was headed to the NBA. He had yet to play a game before. And Jordan there's a movie about this starring.
I think it's recent, right?
Yeah, Ben Affleck and Matt Damon and a number of other people, famous actors. And Jordan wanted to sign with Adidas because that was his favorite brand, and was also courted by Converse. But one of the things that won him over was, well, there were a number of things. First of all, the Air Jordan had a completely revamped design from the standard shoe. And one of the things that had a lot of color on it. So Jordan was going to the Bulls and the shoe was mostly red and black. There was actually a rule in the NBA that the shoe had to be mostly white and that all the players had to wear the same shoe. And that there would be a fine of something like $5,000 a game or something if this wasn't happening. And so I don't know how this really played out, but the story goes is that Nike agreed that they would pay whatever fine Jordan was assessed for wearing these shoes so that he could wear this new shoe. And that became a huge moment of sort of marketing rebellion that was very good for Nike and very good for Michael Jordan as well.
So smart.
And the other thing is that Jordan was not only signed a contract for X dollars, but was allowed to have a portion of the sales for each shoe, which I think has become more standard, hadn't really been done before, and had allowed Jordan to become much wealthier from this contract than previous contracts. And so this sort of sets the celebrity endorsement thing in a different direction as well. The shoe sold fantastically well, exceeding any sales before it. In 18 months, 2.3 million pairs are sold. It's hard to know how much that is. But it's a performance shoe that most people are buying to wear for fashion. And so that's a really important part of this as well. There's also from 87 to 91, and I'm guessing you don't remember this, but there are some commercials that were produced by Wyden Kennedy, which are Portland-based advertisers. And there was an ad campaign that was directed by Spike Lee that starred Michael Jordan and Spike Lee, who was reprising his character Mars Blackman from his first movie, She's Gotta Have It. And those ads were extremely popular and really helped launch, amplify the excitement over what was happening even more. New Air Jordans are released every year. In the past, they wouldn't release a new edition of a shoe every year. Jordans were that. Jordan is its own part of Nike, sort of somewhat independent, but still part of Nike. So it's got so big that I think it was in the 90s, it became sort of a separate brand entity to itself.
I mean, so I remember when I was in, I don't know, middle school or something. And I remember, kids at that time, being enamored with the newest Air Jordans that were coming out, right? Every single year. It was always a new one. I also remember them being very expensive at the time. I never had a pair myself. And the other thing that I remember distinctly about them, and maybe this is just in my memory, or maybe it's actually true, but I kind of remember the Air Jordan branding or Air Jordan shoes not having any obvious Nike branding on them. There's there's the Air Jordan logo, right? Where he's like,
no, they had the swoosh.
Okay. They did have the swoosh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And maybe it had a lower profile on some of the shoes, but certainly the first Jordan, I had the swoosh on it. The Air Jordan 3 became very iconic as well. There was a new designer who came into the fore at that point. And so that was another moment where it became big. But then the jump, and that designer also designed the Jumpman logo, which is Jordan soaring through the air with a basketball behind him ready to shatter a rim or something like that. And so that's become a very recognizable logo in and of itself as well, modeled on the individual himself. Let's close this episode with this one last vignette here, which was, and we're going to tie Nike and Adidas together a little bit here, because in 1987, Horst Dassler died. He was the son of Adi Dassler, took over the company. The company is experiencing decline in revenues, and Adidas decides it's going to rebuild itself somewhat in the same vein as its primary rival, Nike. And so it hires a former Nike employee named Rob Strasser, who comes in to the company, and production starts to cease in Europe and moves to Asia. And so this model of producing things where you have lower costs, lower labor costs, lower fixed costs for factories is something that Adidas starts to embrace under the leadership of somebody who used to work at Nike. A new logo is eventually established for Adidas, and that's the sort of three lines that looks a little bit like a mountain. And that's for Adidas. It was called the Adidas Equipment, which is the performance line. And now we have the Originals line, which maintains the trefoil logo, and is the street fashion casual line, which has Superstars, Gazelle, Samba, Stan Smith, all those kinds of shoes. But there's so much more to say about this. Again, I didn't think that this would be 2 episodes, but we're out of time. And so let's wrap it up, and you can join us again next week and learn more about geography of sneakers. Geoff?
Yeah. And before we run through pluggables, I would be, remiss and totally off brand for myself if I didn't also point out that Adidas's North American headquarters are also located right here in Portland, Oregon.
That's right. There's also an Under Armour headquarters here as well. So this has become kind of a hub.
And Columbia, I mean, a little bit of a different thing, but also still sort of sportswear of sorts. Yeah. And I'm assuming this is all sort of, I don't know if it's on the backs of Nike, but obviously when you have such a mammoth company that sort of started here, you get sort of the expertise here that becomes easy to sort of hire people away and, keep them in the same city. There's probably something there to that effect, but
absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll run through my pluggables now. Yes, my name is Geoff Gibson. I'm the co-host here at Geography as Everything with Hunter. You can find me on YouTube. That's youtube.com/geography by Geoff if you want some more bite-sized videos. But aside from that, please visit us over on Substack. That's geographyiseverything.substack.com, where you can find a bunch of exclusive content. You can find more articles by us, bonus episodes, all kinds of fun geography things. We're really, pulling something together really special over there. And then finally, I just like to ask if you like what you listened to today, and hopefully you come back next week and listen to part 2, feel free to rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts or whatever app you use to listen to podcasts. If that functionality exists, we really appreciate that. I love seeing them. I do read them all. So please do that. Hunter?
I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm co-author of 2 cultural atlases, Portland is a cultural atlas, and Upper Left City is a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. My co-author is David Banis on those. And of course, I am co-host of the podcast that you're listening to, Geography is Everything. Please join us again. Thank you for listening. And we'll be back with more information about sneakers and all kinds of things in the future. Thank you.
All right. We'll see you next time.